Andy Johnson. This is a series of videos looking at racism in special ed world. This one will focus on disproportionality. Disclaimer there, you can stop that and read it if you wish. Disproportionality and overrepresentation. These are the primary sources used. However, I used quite a few sources to come to this, to put this together. So let's identify the problem. First of all, there is a problem. There is a disproportionate number of minority students in special education. As you will see, this disadvantages some students of color and advantages others. This is an example of systemic racism. African Americans account for approximately 14% of the school population. That number will vary slightly, yet 20% of the special education population. Percentages of middle school students with disabilities by gender and race, all. This is a percentage. African American boys and girls, Latinx, white. Disproportionality there. Why is that? African American students are more likely to be identified in the high incident categories. These, by the way, tend to carry the most stigma, social stigma: intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, and emotional behavioral disorder. These are the more subjective categories that rely on teacher referral. However, teacher bias is also part of this. These are the categories in which identification is made after students have begun school. So they rely on that teacher referral, and it uses a process that varies across settings. It's not standard. So judgment plays an important part of this for the initial referral to be identified. This is where teacher bias and expectations play a significant role. When looking at special education comparing black versus white students, once labeled and placed in a special education system, comparing black students versus white students, black students tend to have lower achievement gains and exit the special ed programs at lower rates. Same label, lower achievement, lower exit rates. Why is that? African American students in special ed systems, when compared to white students, fewer positive outcomes, lower academic performance. Put in segregated, self-contained settings, the room down at the end of the hall, versus inclusive classroom settings, where in that segregated setting, they have little or no exposure to non-disabled peers, and this is important, tend to have higher dropout rates, and they subsist on a standard, watered-down, low-level curriculum. So there is disproportionality as well in disciplinary actions, suspension, school dropout rates. And by the way, if you are suspended, you cannot learn if you are not in school. Disproportionality, high rates involvement in the legal system, living in poverty, unemployment within the community, healthcare conditions. 90% of the teachers in American schools are white. Few professors in higher education are of color. So the conclusion we can make is white privilege and racism is ingrained in society. This also occurs in special education. Race matters. It's prevalent in education and special education. Racism, systemic racism, is prevalent. You see the high school completion rates right there, white versus black. This is 20 years old, but these numbers have not changed. What is white privilege? Any phenomenon, whether individual, structural, political, economic, or social, that serves to privilege whites while oppressing people of color. This could include teacher bias, attitude, perception, and expectations. It could include curriculum and pedagogical practices based on white superiority, biased educational policies, and school funding formulas that contribute to inequality and inequity. Systemic racism, again, are the policies, procedures, rules, laws, regulations, traditions, institutions, and other governances. It could be implicit or explicit, intentional or not. They disadvantage people of color and provide advantage and opportunities to the white privileged majority. They get more opportunities and more resources. That is systemic racism. It exists in society, it exists in education, and especially in special education. So we have this intersectionality, it's called, between race, economic status, and disproportionality. It's called DisCrit, disability and critical race theory. Marginalized groups often do not exist in a single group or category. So being in two categories, marginalized groups become further marginalized. Special education for African American students, the intent was always for special education to be a service and not a place, to provide individualized instruction for students with disability. However, individualized instruction often becomes standardized instruction. The same programs are provided to all students, just watered down and slowed down. Students get an overabundance of scripted programs. Special ed teachers tend to use direct instruction and scripted programs that are implemented with fidelity. Now, the goal was always to return students to a general education setting once their goals were met. Once appropriate strategies and modifications were in place, the goal was always to exit the program. However, this often does not happen, and I often see this in terms of reading. Students, once they're in the special education system, experience no acceleration. For many African American students, compared to white students with the same label, it becomes a form of segregation. As I said, they're more often put in segregated settings versus inclusive settings, and this keeps African American students from receiving an equitable education in a gen ed environment. So referral to special education becomes a new legalized form of structural segregation and racism. They experience low-level instruction here, and that results in low-level outcomes. That's the overuse of direct instruction. Breaking things into small little bits means you get small little bits of learning. Insufficient funding for schools is part of the systemic racism. Inadequate funding of schools attended primarily by African American. Racism is the hoarding of resources and opportunities. These are ours. We get them. You don't. You see the lowest minority enrollment funding per students. This is 2000, but these have not changed a bit. Highest minority enrollment funding per student per year. Imagine if all schools were funded equally, all classrooms had able, skilled, knowledgeable teachers, all students had access to health care, adequate health care. All students came to school fed. They weren't hungry. All parents had access to well-paying jobs. All parents had access to quality preschool and child care. What would happen? Much of the disproportionality would disappear, as well as the achievement gap would disappear. Now, the economic and political systems in place creates the achievement gaps. It creates the conditions that the achievement gaps occur. It's the hoarding and diverting of resources. We get the tax cuts, and then they turn around and blame the teachers, the parents, the schools. The tax cuts go to the wealthy, they hoard the resources, and then they tend to blame the schools, the teachers, or the problems. If they would just get tough, if they would just use more direct instruction, teach more phonics, you do that. Give us the resources. Give us the resources, and you'll see much of the academic achievement gap disappear. More often, in urban, primarily African American schools, you find under-credentialed or inadequately prepared teachers, not a rigorous curriculum. The schools, the physical structures are not good. They're crumbling. Overcrowded classrooms is probably one of the most significant variables in determining a low quality of education. An inadequate general education curriculum and fewer books, computers, and other resources. These all increase the likelihood of being referred to special education. All right? It is not an equal playing field. All children do not have the same opportunity. Much of their opportunity is determined by their skin color and by their zip code. All students, of course, should have well-prepared teachers in order to have equitable learning opportunities. This means that teachers should have equitable working conditions and pay. The teachers in the inner city should be paid and have the same conditions as the suburb or the wealthier school districts. It's this inequities in funding related to structural systems of white privilege and racism that maintains racism in special education. People feel entitled to the education their students receive. We pay more taxes, so we should get better schools. Well, that all occurs at the expense of the poor. If these communities had an abundance of good-paying jobs, they too would pay more taxes and have good schools. This is hidden systemic racism that privileges some and disadvantages the others. White privilege is maintained by insufficient funding of schools, primarily attended by African American students, by culturally inappropriate and unresponsive curriculum, and by white superiority. White superiority is, these are the values that I hold, you should hold them too. This is the history that I think is important, you should think it is important too. You should assimilate, you should be like us. That is white superiority. These things create an culturally inappropriate and unresponsive curriculum and maintain disproportionality. Inadequate teacher preparation. We need to better prepare teachers to address the needs of ethnically diverse students. We need culturally responsive teaching. Now, multicultural pedagogy is not a recipe, it's not an algorithm or a set of steps to follow or a set of a specific pedagogical program. All right. It starts with an understanding of the situation of what racism is and white privileges. You understand the principles of critical race theory. You understand this. Then you are better able to create the conditions to teach from a multicultural perspective. If we had high quality instruction in the general education classroom, this would decrease the likelihood of special education placement. So we must address in our teacher preparation programs implicit bias that we all hold, prejudices, this preconceived notion of what blackness is, and understand and address what white privilege is. We must address the fact that whiteness now is seen as the norm. You should speak like us, you should be like us. Our testing represents this white culture. We must realize that that is not the norm.